All right, I know people are still logging in, but we're going to get started just to respect everybody's time. And so I want to welcome you today to the Center for Rural Policy and Development, our webinar on shifting energy infrastructure in rural Minnesota. This is a topic that has been ongoing for quite some time, and we're excited to have a panel discussion today about that. But we also have a report, and that's kind of what spurred having this webinar, is our report that's now live at our website on ruralmn.org, talking about how rural Minnesota is doing in transitioning to renewable energy. So I encourage you to check that out. And also this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to find it in the coming days on our YouTube channel. Joining us today, we're really excited. Our lead researcher on this project is Whitney Oachs. And then we have, as a panelist, we have Jennifer Cady from Minnesota Power, Sid Briggs from Steele Waseca Cooperative Electric, and then Christina Palladino is our moderator today. So you'll be hearing from all of them today, and we thank them for their participation. I wanted to very briefly mention our upcoming reports here in 2022. We are just at the early side of getting reports out. As you can see, we have 8 more reports coming out, hopefully by the end of June, so that's a lot. So you can see there, our next one coming out will be farmland and property taxes. So those of you that deal with schools and property taxes, you will definitely want to tune in for that. And then we have a couple childcare ones, talking about diversity and inclusion. Rural EMS, emergency management services, we're very excited about that, to be working with a couple different rural medical, rural health association entities and talking about the differences in EMS. And then one that we've been working on quite a long time is the impacts of career and technical education and how that impacts migration patterns in Southwest Minnesota. And then we also have water treatment. We're just starting to jump into the water treatment challenges, and dark store theory. So a lot of new and exciting topics. I know I've learned a lot from our researchers just trying to keep up on all of this. And as always, for those of you that have joined us before, you know our social media channels, but you can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us today. If you do have questions, please use the chat function. We do have somebody monitoring the chat box, so please feel free to ask questions all throughout the day or all throughout this time. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Whitney Oachs. Hey, Whitney, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much, Julie, for introducing the center. And give me just a second here while I share my screen.
Sure.
I'm really excited.
Yeah, I'll give the viewers a quick background. Whitney has been with us, what, 1.5 years, 2 years? She started as an intern with us at the Humphrey School, and we were able to hire her on this last year as a contract researcher, and she has done wonderful work for us. And so we're excited for her to present this report. And I will turn it over to you, Whitney.
Thank you so much, Julie. All right, let me get this going. Awesome. So I'm really excited to speak with you all about this new report that we just published, Shifting Energy Infrastructure in Rural Minnesota. Before we get into it, you know, Minnesota is really at this kind of pivotal moment in our energy practices, both our energy sources, but also our transmission lines and grid system. And so this project was really interesting to delve in on, particularly as it relates to rural Minnesota. And so as you'll see, rural issues and rural electric distribution issues are a really, really big part of this story towards carbon reduction in the state of Minnesota. So to talk a little bit about the shifting landscape of energy infrastructure, in 2007, the Minnesota legislature passed the Next Generation Act. And so the Next Generation Act requires an 80% reduction in carbon output by the year 2050. And ever since then, as you can see in this chart that I have here, Minnesota has greatly increased their renewable electric generation. You know, they heard this mandate, electric providers heard this mandate, and they responded. And so you can see that after 2007, after this bill was passed, we're now at a point here in 2019 was the last data we had, where about 25% of Minnesota's electricity came from renewable sources. And last year, that number for the first time surpassed nuclear energy as the second highest energy source outside of coal and fossil fuels. However, despite this progress, Minnesota is still not quite on track to meet its carbon reduction goals. So in the Next Generation Act, there was a series of interim goals set in place to make sure that, Minnesota was doing the carbon reduction necessary that was mandated by the state. But you can see with the current progression, we haven't reduced our carbon output by quite enough just yet. And what's important about this carbon reduction figure is that it's not just electric utility providers. It relates to agriculture and transportation as well. But electric distribution and energy sources play a really big role in this overall effort towards carbon reduction. And what you'll find, and what I found in this report, is that some utility providers are having a harder time with the development of renewables. And this has to do with how utility firms operate in the state of Minnesota. But before we get into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about rural electrification. So around 1930, only 3% of rural farmsteads in the state of Minnesota had access to electricity. But in 1936, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, rural electrification began this really big initiative in the country. And within 20 years, we were at 90% electricity access in rural homesteads. So this was a really, really big transition in a really short period of time, from no power to having power. And how we created these electricity access in rural Minnesota was by creating electric distribution cooperatives. So rather than have a market-based strategy for bringing out electricity into rural areas, the government did was gave co-ops loans and allowed them to be income tax exempt. And that allowed these less dense areas to be electrified. And since the 1930s, this kind of reliance on members and loans has been largely unchanged, save for one key difference with rural electric cooperatives. It's that now it's not just the electric distribution cooperative giving energy to the households in the rural area. They're actually served also by a power pool with a larger generation and transmission cooperative. So cooperative utilities are member owned and operated, and they serve about 34% of all Minnesota households. Minnesota is home to 44 distribution cooperatives and 6 generation and transmission cooperatives. This means that even though there are multiple different co-ops with specific groups of members serving specific regions of rural Minnesota, the power that they get comes from only 6 G&Ts. And so in this figure that I have here on the slide, you can see how there's the G&T, it creates a power pool, it generates a power pool, it gives that power to the electric distribution cooperative, and then that power is sold to the household or firm or whatever consumer that is. And so that's the way the majority of rural Minnesotans and really rural people across the nation get their electricity. So because cooperatives are income tax exempt and have smaller profit margins than investor-owned firms, they're often locked in and are often locked into 40-year contracts with their G&T cooperative. It becomes harder to navigate a transition towards renewable energy like was mandated in the 2007 Next Generation Act. In addition, some of the contracts that electric distribution cooperatives have with their G&Ts allow only a couple dozen kilowatts of local renewable energy generation. So already you can kind of see the barriers here to rural cooperatives transitioning to rural energy sources, particularly because, as I stated before, they were only created because of loans provided by both public and private firms. So this outstanding debt still exists and serves the way that they operate. So thinking about creating a whole new infrastructure base, like using solar, wind, hydro, that's a lot of upfront costs that aren't necessarily being garnered by the organization. In comparison to the cooperative model for utility providers, we have the investor-owned model. So investor-owned utility firms are definitely leading the charge in carbon reduction and renewable electricity generation in the state of Minnesota. This is in a large part because they're able to build equity and have more funds to leverage this new development. Xcel Energy is Minnesota's largest electric utility and serves about 3.7 million customers. And in April 2021, they announced a reduction in carbon output by 80% and would end the use of coal to generate power in 1930 by 2030. And so that was Xcel Energy's big move in saying, here's how we're going to not only address the recommendations in the Next Generation Act, but also more broadly shift our energy sources. Minnesota Power is also a major investor-owned electric provider. And so this is in Northeast Minnesota, so serves a lot of mining industries and paper plant firms. And I'm sure our panelist, Jennifer, will be able to talk about Minnesota Power a lot more than I can. But they've also made huge strides in renewable generation. So they switched energy sources from 95% coal to 50% renewables between 2007 and 2020. This is a really, really major shift for a provider. And with plans to retire the Cohasset plant, Minnesota Power intends to become carbon free by the year 2050. And so these are really big strides that they're taking, in part because investor-owned utility providers are able to take advantage of green energy tax breaks and other incentives that the government has given out to incentivize the development of renewables. Also, the benefits of an investor-owned model mean that electricity can usually be supplied at a more competitive price, but only for households or firms in high density or high use areas. Why we have the electric cooperative system, because cooperatives work better in these low density, smaller rural areas, and investor-owned models work better in these higher density areas. So now that we understand a little bit about how utilities operate in the state of Minnesota, I want you to take a look at these two charts. So these two charts show the energy source estimates from both Xcel Energy over the years 2019 and 2020, and the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association's energy source estimates for the year 2020. So both of these are national, but they give you a sense of where our energy is coming from at present. And so right now, the fact of the matter is that 66% of energy distributed by cooperatives is coming from fossil fuels versus about 53% is generated by fossil fuels by Xcel Energy. And so this is a kind of a significant percentage point difference. And when you look at this chart here, you can see the growth of renewables in just 1 year from Xcel Energy, and also how the cooperative energy estimates, they're kind of lagging behind a little bit of these investor-owned firms. And so there are some reasons as to why cooperatives are having a harder time with this energy transition than investor-owned firms. And this barriers to this energy shift include high upfront costs for renewable development and debt tied to coal power plants. So one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that this energy infrastructure shift that is occurring in the state of Minnesota is having an effect on all utility providers. So that's investor-owned providers included. You know, everyone is feeling the strain on the utility side of accommodating this shift, but rural cooperatives are facing even bigger barriers than the investor-owned firms. And so the high upfront cost of renewable development, I mean, that's kind of an obvious one, right? Like transmission lines, generation facilities, storage, batteries, these things operate differently under renewables than they do using coal and natural gas. And so we have to build these new systems first before we can use them. And that's a lot of money up front. And that's a lot of money up front for all utility providers, but specifically for rural co-ops because they have so much debt already tied to coal-powered operations. Because cooperatives, both electric distribution cooperatives and G&Ts, have relied since their formation on government loans, this creates some questions as to where are the funds for this renewable development, but also what's going to happen with all of these sunk costs we already have invested in coal and fossil fuels if we close these plants. And so that makes the barrier a little bit more challenging. Another barrier to the energy shift that we're seeing is the availability of green energy tax credits and cooperatives' income tax exemptions. So I mentioned a little bit before how investor-owned firms are able to use green energy tax credits to put more money into renewable development, but cooperatives do not qualify for these incentives and these benefits because they're income tax exempt and member-owned, so they don't build equity. And so again, this goes to the question of, okay, so how are we supposed to do this shift? If the state is saying we need to reduce our carbon output by this much and renewables is the answer to that, how can we afford to do it when we aren't getting direct assistance? And lastly, a big barrier to the energy shift is consumer price sensitivity and workforce concerns. So rural Minnesotans have lower average incomes than urban Minnesotans, but also these households spend a higher portion of their monthly income on their energy bills than urban Minnesotans. So there's a higher cost burden for rural homes in paying for their energy. And so if the solution to accommodate this shift towards renewables is raising rates, that has an even greater impact on rural Minnesotans than it does on other Minnesotans because of these difference in costs. In addition, there's workforce concerns here too. So a lot of the natural gas and especially coal plants that we have, they are located in rural areas. And so those plants are not only giving tax revenue to their local counties or cities, but also they're employing a lot of people. And so the prospect of closing plants can be, politically, socially, and economically challenging, particularly when you have then the set of workforce that is definitely not unskilled, but isn't necessarily trained to work in renewables, say, okay, we close this plant, what are we going to do about it? And so these are the three really big barriers that rural cooperatives are facing in this energy transition. Nevertheless, however, there are shifts across the board toward renewable energy generation. But understandably, consumers in rural Minnesota are concerned as their energy bills continue to rise. So in the last 20 years, the average monthly electric bill in the state of Minnesota has just about doubled. And that's, a cost that all of us feel. So even if you're not involved on the utility side, pretty much everyone has to pay their electric bill every month. And so when you see the prospect of raising rates, it can make some feel more hesitant towards this future of renewables and carbon reduction because we don't want to be spending more each month on these fixed costs. In addition, raising rates has implications for firms, manufacturing firms that use our energy as well. So think mining and paper production. These industries are globally competitive and price sensitive. So the cost of energy it takes for them to create what they're doing, directly has a direct relationship to their competitiveness on the market. And so even though the state of Minnesota has been making these huge strides and is really at this turning point in this shift towards renewable energy, there are some policy questions that our legislators should consider as we're thinking about going 80% carbon reduction or carbon free or whatever have you, whatever that next goal is. There's some considerations that we need to be having. In addition, kind of the last thing I want to bring up is reliability and grid system concerns are also on people's mind as well when we're talking about energy. So even though the shift towards renewables isn't directly related to reliability and grid system concerns at present, there are aging grid infrastructure issues across the nation and in Minnesota that need to be addressed, especially as we're shifting our energy sources. And worries about the reliability of the electric grid following blackouts in Texas have also amplified tension surrounding renewable systems, because of course we want to be able to, flick the switch and turn our lights on, or, especially have heat in the wintertime when it is as cold as it is today. I'm really thankful my heat is on. And so these considerations are really important to think about, because we're going through such an overhaul at the state level of our energy sources. And so moving forward, this is kind of my last slide before I bring it to Christina and we, talk as a group with these amazing panelists we have, is that, there are some cooperatives who have ideas for the future and how to get to this renewable future with a little bit of assistance. And so I won't go into this list specifically, but there are plenty of options out there for the state and federal government to support utility providers in implementing this transition. And in recording a podcast about this report with Jennifer, actually last week or 2 weeks ago, she mentioned holistic sustainability as something that's really important to consider when we're talking about renewables. So it is not just environmental sustainability, but also community sustainability and sustainability of our systems. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we're doing this shift, because cooperatives in particular must be able to fully participate in this energy transition for the Next Generation Act goals to be achieved. And if we don't create more avenues for cooperatives to be involved, it is going to be more challenging to meet these interim and final goals that we had established in 2017 or in 2007. And one really interesting point that I heard also last week that isn't in the report, but I want to bring it up because it was really fascinating, is that we could be giving cooperatives direct payments, perhaps, that are equivalent to what they might receive from a green energy tax credit. So that's just one of the many creative solutions we have in navigating this energy transition. And so with that, I really want to introduce our mediator for today, Christina. Christina is an amazing journalist and will be leading us in this discussion with two experts in the field, people who know a lot more about being a utility provider and providing electricity to the state of Minnesota than I do. Christina?
Great. Whitney, thank you so much for that really informative presentation. I really liked how you broke down all the different aspects of the report and made it relatable to people tuning in right now, and how we can incorporate little tactics to transition to, renewable energy eventually. So I'm Christina Palladino. I'll be moderating the rest of this discussion. I'm a senior principal of media relations and communications at Park Street Public, and also have a background of more than 20 years as a television news journalist in a variety of cities across the country. I'd like to introduce our panel and just have you both say a little bit about yourselves and also kind of talk about the work that you do. So first, I'd like to bring in Sid Briggs, General Manager of Steele Waseca Cooperative Electric. Sid, if you could just take a minute or so to give a little introduction of yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Christina. So I'm Sid Briggs. I'm the general manager at Steele Waseca Cooperative Electric. We serve, it's a small utility. We cover a lot of territory, about 5 meters per mile. I think we'll get into some of this later on some of the things with utilities. My background is accounting, finance, and member services. I've been at 2 other co-ops besides this one in Texas. So I'm familiar with ERCOT that Whitney referred to. And then the other one was in Arkansas. I tell everybody it just wasn't cold enough down there, so we wanted to move north. It's really the job opportunity. But I've got about 30 years of experience, and I've specialized actually in cost of power issues and rate making.
Great. And also joining us is Jennifer Cady, Manager of Regulatory Strategy and Policy at Minnesota Power. Jennifer, if you'd like to introduce yourself for a minute or two.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. My name is Jennifer Cady. I lead the team at Minnesota Power that interfaces with our state regulators as well as other interested stakeholders. So like Whitney described, there are investor-owned utilities in addition to co-ops. We are one of those IOUs and fully regulated by the state of Minnesota. Minnesota Power serves northeastern Minnesota over a territory of about 26,000 square miles. Think about roughly from Duluth to International Falls out to Little Falls in the west. And I'm just really happy to be here for this conversation and thankful to the center and Whitney for highlighting this really important topic.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'd like each of you to give a little bit of a background or a description to what is a cooperative and kind of the role of a utility company for maybe those who are tuned in and don't really know the full context. I think that would be a nice way to kind of set the stage. Sid, if you could just kind of talk about what is a co-op, what's its role, and what are some of the benefits to being a part of one?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Again, as Whitney mentioned, co-ops were formed back in the 30s. And the reason was because so many people didn't have electricity and it was expensive to get it out there. So again, they were formed in order to distribute electricity out to those who were very far away. The co-op I worked with in Texas actually averaged 1 meter per mile. Actually, when I started working there, it was a little under 1 meter per mile. It was one of those that was really spread out and very difficult to maintain cost. But that's one of the things we deal with. What it ends up doing is we have more substations, we have more infrastructure than other utilities have for the same number of people. Many of us formed in what we call G&Ts, or generation and transmission cooperatives, that was mentioned earlier, and we are members of the G&Ts, just like our customers are members of us. Our members actually elect directors. The directors that were elected here at Steele Waseca are the ones who actually interviewed and hired me to be the general manager, and then we're all members of the G&T, and we have a voice there. They report to us. As we talk about different issues, I'll describe some of the things that we do and some of the input, but we have definite input, and we communicate with our member customers, no matter what our decisions are, whether we're looking at retiring a coal plant, using more wind, using more solar on rebates. I get calls and I get letters and I get emails from our actual members. So again, we try to stay really close to them, and I respond to them. And then sometimes I take their information and I get in touch with our G&T and get some detailed information so that I can respond. But that's we're very close. There's a lot of contact. We actually have members that actually form our nominating committee that goes out and looks for people to run for the board. But that's the benefit of being a co-op.
Really interesting. And Jennifer, obviously, how do you guys differ from co-ops?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Well, as Whitney mentioned, investor-owned utilities primarily were born out of metro areas, though certainly there are IOUs that serve rural America across the country, like Minnesota Power. The key difference is that the Supreme Court determined that electricity was an essential service and in the public interest. Electricity providers are what's called a natural monopoly in economic theory. You can't always control where the electrons go. They go on the path of least resistance, and it takes a lot of infrastructure. So in place of competition of multiple providers, we operate under a regulated model. So we have state regulators that oversee all of our expenses, our rate setting, new projects to ensure that we are operating in the public interest, even though we have investors that help us raise capital for projects. So that's the key difference is how we are regulated, but we also have some similarities. Certainly Minnesota Power serves rural parts of the state. We have some of the similar tax credit challenges because of where we're at on renewables. So some differences, some similarities.
Right. Well, we may not technically be experiencing a polar vortex, but it's pretty darn cold out there. The Arctic air is back. During periods of frigid weather, how reliable do you think our current electric grid is? Jennifer, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Yeah, well, statistically, we have one of the most reliable electric systems in the world. And I think we're pretty spoiled, Americans are, in terms of what we take for granted, that the grid is always there. I will say, today it's, I think statistically 99% reliable. We certainly have power more times than we don't, but as, the climate is changing, as we experience more and more extreme weather events, aging infrastructure, transition of the system, we really are focusing on not only ensuring reliability, but transitioning to a grid that's also resilient in the face of all of those challenges. So I would say on the whole, at the highest level, Americans benefit from an incredibly reliable system, but we know that there are challenges that we have to continue to stay on top of to ensure the grid remains reliable and increasingly resilient.
Sid, from the co-op perspective, how reliable is the electric grid for your clients?
Yeah, our grid is the same one for Minnesota Power. It's really big. It's what we call it MISO. It's the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and it actually stretches from Canada all the way down to Louisiana. And that's one of the big benefits, is that it's big. Okay. Now there's many others. There's a lot of coordination and a lot that's been done, as Jennifer said, to make it resilient. I'll touch on it real briefly because there's so many things that we could talk about. But it actually encourages interruptible loads. It encourages curtailable loads, but to start with, it's just a big grid. And so one of the things that we talk about all the time is just being able to have reliable power. And we talk about renewables, and one of the problems with renewables, especially with wind and solar, is that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. But if you have a really big grid, okay, somewhere on it, at least the wind will be blowing all the time, and so the size really helps. But again, there's a lot of coordination that MISO does that actually is very beneficial, and again makes us very, very resilient. And it's the being able to I say control loads, and what that means is it's a nice word for cutting off power to certain loads. And so some of our industrial and commercial loads will agree with us, and we'll give them a special rate. And I think all utilities develop this. And so where there's a need, where there's a constraint in the transmission system, where there's just some huge demand for power, they will either cut back part of the power, they'll cut back all the power. Some of them will have a generator they can run on for a while, and that gives us more capacity and more room for the tight times. We also do a great deal with our residential members with water heaters, and can control water heaters at different times, and that again allows us to have different capacity. But again, there's more than that, but that just gives you an idea of what a resilient grid, some of the things a resilient grid can do.
Wow. So we know about a year ago, obviously it was national news in Texas. There were rolling blackouts. Obviously people died from that due to, a very rare event of severe weather, cold weather hitting their area. Although our infrastructure here in Minnesota is built differently, why should we still be concerned about what happened down south? Jennifer? Oh, I think you're still on mute there.
Thank you. I think there are more researchers than we can count that are looking into what happened in Texas and all of the many aspects that made that situation what it was. So I'll touch on a few with the caveat that it's a complex system and a complex challenge. One of the things is I think we are, as I mentioned, experiencing more extreme weather events than we had before. And I heard an anecdote that Texas experiencing freezing temperatures like that would be like us experiencing a hurricane, not necessarily something that has traditionally been planned for. So I think one lesson from that is that we need to, work on making our system really resilient against, maybe weather that we hadn't experienced decades ago. So I think that's one thing. And I think the integrated nature of the grid that Sid mentioned is an important lesson to take away, that sometimes we may not be able to meet all of our needs ourselves. And so having really good relationships and partnerships across the region is an important part going forward. Especially living in the climate that we do, electricity is, critical to our health and safety, and something that we always need to keep an eye on. So those are just a few of the lessons, but I think there'll be many books written about what happened in Texas and what we can learn from it.
Yeah, Sid, your thoughts?
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that, but just a little. Let's see, it should be a concern. These things can happen, and they can happen anywhere. Obviously, there were some things that needed to be looked at a little bit harder. Some planning that needed to be done there with the ERCOT system that I believe wasn't being done, but only some. The biggest thing was that it was a very unusual event. But that's what we need to think about, is what are some unusual events that can happen. And so I had a lot of customers that were obviously concerned and wanted to be sure as much as possible that we wouldn't have that happen. And so the reality is that sometime or other there will be some sort of constraint, whether it's through a storm or whether it's through demand or again, just anything that causes fuel to be expensive or in short supply. And we may have some rolling blackouts sometime, but again, it's just planning ahead, looking at those type of things that are really unusual. And again, the biggest thing that we've already covered is that we have a large grid, and again, it's very well developed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so as we heard Whitney discuss in her presentation, Minnesota is unlikely to meet its carbon reduction goals by 2050. What does that mean for utilities and rural co-ops? How do we strike that balance between striving for renewable energy, but also realizing we still have residents and businesses that depend on fossil fuels? Sid, I'd like to go back to you on that one.
Sure. We're doing Steele Waseca, and then through Great River Energy is actually doing very well. Our goals were 25% by 2030, and we've already hit and surpassed the 25%, and we're headed to easily be at 50% of renewables. So behind the investor-owned utilities, but headed toward that by 2030. So again, we're doing well through Great River Energy. I think others are a little slower than Great River Energy is, and so again, it's a valid concern. Some of the things that make a rural utility, again, a little bit different and difficult is we have a lot of investment going into communications. So we actually started developing a communication with automatic metering infrastructure where we can get meter readings and we get information off our meters. We actually started developing that before most other utilities. And right now we can read all our meters and get a lot of information from our meters from the office without even sending a truck out or a vehicle out. We've developed that actually quite a few years ago. And the reason we did that was because it was costing so much to serve our members to do that. So that's where a lot of our investment has gone, as opposed to developing renewables, okay, or as opposed to being able to close down a coal plant or a gas plant. And so that was one of the disadvantages we had, is that there were other things we really needed to invest in. But that's one of the reasons that there's a delay. We are on our way. We are developing it. We have some great plans, especially through Great River Energy, to develop. And in fact, I don't think we're going to have a trouble being at 80% renewable by 2050. There's a good chance we pass that. The renewables have developed where, especially on wind, there's some great prices on wind out there. And I think most everybody's heard the news about us getting rid of our largest coal plant, the plant that's about 40% of our capacity. We're getting rid of it, and we're going all wind on the balance of it. So again, there's been some great things done. We are going to be a little bit slower just by definition of who we are, and the fact that the costs that we've incurred for all of our facilities are divided out over a much smaller group.
Yeah, I'm obviously, as we're experiencing this Arctic air back in our area, I'm seeing people tweet like, "Good thing for fossil fuels, keeping us warm." and, just their strike, but obviously it's, top of
Mhm.
mind. There was an NPR, story on this just yesterday. Jennifer, from your perspective, how do we kind of figure out where we're going here? We want to become, renewable and seek towards green energy and be clean, but also there's a lot of people that still depend on fossil fuel still.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question, Christina. I mean, the first thing I'd want to point out is that while the state as a whole is trailing on its carbon goals, the electric sector has surpassed kind of its share of that. Now, recognizing we're all in this together, we're all trying to reduce carbon overall. I think it's important to note that the electric sector has done an incredible job and met all of our goals. So first and foremost, I think what we can do is try to help other sectors decarbonize as well, like industry, agriculture, transportation. They have significant challenges and barriers to reducing carbon as well. I think your first question started with, reliable grid. And survey after survey tells us that customers value reliability over everything else, right? Because if your power is not on today when it's 14 below zero in Duluth, customers don't much care where it's coming from as long as it gets turned back on. And so I think when we talk about the transition away from fossil fuels, every utility is unique in its, generation mix. For example, Xcel Energy has a significant amount of nuclear power in its fleet that is carbon free, but can provide baseload generation. There's a carbon moratorium or a nuclear moratorium in the state of Minnesota, and Minnesota Power doesn't have that resource to call upon. So I think we need to recognize, as Sid mentioned, that utilities are very different. They have different considerations. We need to maintain reliability, of course, always. And so being very thoughtful of how we transition away from fossil fuels in a way that maintains reliability and kind of uses technology as it emerges will be a challenge and an opportunity for all of us.
Yeah. And I do want to encourage the people that are participating in the webinar to, throw some questions that you have in the chat. We're going to, ask those as we go along here. And so let's go back to a question that we have. It says, Texas was just and this is kind of what we were talking about, the rolling blackouts last year in Texas. The person says Texas was just a few moments away from completely losing their power grid for months, requiring them to do a black start. The Texas experience was a catastrophe, but could have been even worse. Unfortunately, not much has been improved. I'm curious how we, Minnesota taxpayers, will all pay for this. Does this also influence our natural gas prices? I'm not sure who wants to take a swing at this first.
Well, I think the accounting guy should do it, so Sid should take it first.
Yeah, let's see, the initial effect of what happened in Texas doesn't have an effect on us. Again, because of the separateness. They're responsible for their cost, and it will be there. Okay. Overall, this is a good question. Overall, what will it do to the market? Okay, it will cause the market to have higher gas prices. We're already seeing it. Let's see. I live on a municipal system. Okay, it's a good municipal. It does a good job, but they're already letting us know about the higher gas prices that we're experiencing. We're dealing with our G&T, with Great River Energy. Right now, it's not having a big effect on us, okay? But those higher gas prices are there. We had a higher pass through, and so that is about the best thing we can do is, and this may not be a popular answer. Jennifer, I hope you have a better one than I have. But anyway, is actually prepare for higher utility costs when you're dealing with gas. Okay, it's still a good value. Okay, and it's still a worthwhile, by all means, a worthwhile fossil fuel. It actually has lower carbon emissions than coal does. So we're doing the right thing with closing down coal plants and moving that way. We still need that transition. We still need the fossil fuel right now in some way until we get the infrastructure built up, until we have enough wind and solar to take the place. But since I'm not running for office anywhere, I'm not a politician. I guess I can say this easier than anybody else. You might want to prepare for just higher utility prices.
Jennifer, do you want to answer that question? I can repeat it again for you if you want me to.
Well, no, I don't think I need it repeated. I would just add that I think, broader than just Texas, we will all, there's a cost of hardening our system. There's a cost of modernizing our system. And there's a cost to making it more resilient for more scenarios we planned for in the past. And so, it's not directly because something happened in Texas, it'll cause, additional costs for us, like a direct correlation. But certainly utilities are starting to plan differently as we experience these weather changes, and there is a cost to that infrastructure.
Excellent. So we have another question. I love the questions coming. Scott Hall, how can utilities help other sectors like industries, mining and paper, agriculture, and transportation?
Well, I can take a first response at that, Christina, because we're in a great position because we actually sell a product that will help them decarbonize, and that's cleaner electricity. So for example, we can help transportation electrify by building out electric vehicle charging infrastructure, offering electric vehicle incentives, and trying to make that process of electrifying transportation easier. Minnesota Power is one of the most unique utilities in the country, in that 75% of our energy sales go to a handful of very large industrial users in northeastern Minnesota, primarily in iron mining and paper production. And so working with those industries to electrify operations where possible, we've been exploring really cool ideas like mine truck electrification. I think there's emerging technology, and we can certainly be a partner to these other industries because the product that we're providing is 50% renewable. And so if that is displacing, primarily just fossil fuels like gasoline or fuel oil, that's an incredible carbon savings just off the bat. So we're here to help other sectors.
Sid, there was another comment in here in the chat. It says, it seems like when this stuff happens, again, I think referring to the issue with Texas, lots of people claim that we can't prepare our infrastructure for cold weather. There were claims from Texas that clean energy like wind turbines were the problem, which is strange because Minnesotan wind turbines weren't having issues. I feel like the wind turbines take a lot of slack, even though usually they seem to do pretty well. Maybe you could just kind of reflect on that. Obviously, I remember driving to South Dakota a couple of summers ago, and there's a whole area where you're like, wow, this is pretty crazy. They're all here right now.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that can be done. If you want, see, I had a friend who had a great phrase, and he said, if you want economy, you have to pay for it. And so they're in Texas, okay, where normally you don't have a lot of really cold weather. There were some things that were not done that are done here in Minnesota. Obviously, we know the cold's coming, and we prepare for it. And so there are heating elements that can be in wind turbines, okay, that heat the wind turbine up. So it actually uses some electricity that actually heats the wind turbine up so that it can operate in the cold weather. There are things you can do at gas plants. If you remember in Texas, they had some of the pipelines were freezing up. There are things you can do. You can insulate that. You can actually use electricity to heat them up or heat up the pumps or the facilities, whatever it takes. I think Texas is now moving that way. Has learned their lesson and are moving that way. Gee, I sure hope so. But I feel sure that they're moving that way for should this happen again. And again, it was a real unusual thing. But yes, wind turbines and gas plants can operate in really cold weather. The cold weather that Texas had is still nothing like the cold weather that Minnesota has or is even having today. But there are things they can do. It will cost, and they will have to pass that cost along, but it'll be really worthwhile. As we've stated and talked about, the big thing is reliability. We'll pay higher rates if we know we're going to continue to have electricity. And these kind of costs, just so everybody knows, these kind of costs Steele Waseca doesn't make any money on it. It's just it's an increase in our cost of power. Our cost of service is where, you know, sometimes we have to increase rates. We haven't in a while. We've been doing really good. And most of the increases is in fuel. Well, those type of things, those type of that type of planning that Texas needs to do, that some of the other probably southern states or even western states, as the temperature changes, they need to be looking at it. Again, Texas actually was a great warning, and we should all take a hard look at things. I just so you know, I questioned my G&T. I questioned Great River Energy. I talked to a lot of people. I made them tell me what we're doing so that I can pass that on to my customers, so that we don't experience what Texas did.
Yeah. You don't think about something like that happening until it happens. So it's good to be proactive about it. We had another great question. I'm loving these questions from Ida Rukavina. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Could you talk about the demand for key critical minerals needed for batteries, turbines, solar panels, and whether the supply chain issues will impact those prices as well with the high demand? Is there potential for new mines where these minerals are to open domestic sources? Jennifer, do you want to answer that one?
I would love to answer that as the electricity provider to Minnesota's mining industry. You know, as we talk about the energy transition, there is no doubt of the incredible need for critical minerals. When you think about what goes into electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, not to mention all of the basic infrastructure like solar racking, all of the iron and steel needed to make this stuff happen beyond just critical minerals, I think there's absolutely a role for our domestic supply for a couple of reasons. First, as I mentioned in the podcast, Minnesota Power is a firm believer that sustainability should be evaluated holistically. And that includes considering impacts to the climate, of course, but impacts to customers and communities. And so when we think about who mines these minerals better, I don't think there's anyone that does it better than Iron Rangers, but I'm of course biased because I am one. But we have some of the highest safety standards for workers in the world, and we're supplying these mines with some of the cleanest electricity in the world. So the minerals and the material coming out of our Iron Range is the cleanest and the safest. So I think it's a higher value of the product that we need for the energy transition. And I think there's also a component to supply chain security. So COVID-19, this global pandemic, has really shown us how tenuous some of our global supply chains can be. And if all of our solar panels are being manufactured in one region of China, that creates a really significant vulnerability. So I think that there is a huge role, and Energy Secretary Granholm has even talked about this, the role of domestic mineral production in the energy transition. So it's a great point. And I think, you know, we as an electricity provider are here to do everything we can to keep our mines competitive so they can continue to produce this really important material that they do.
Great. I think there's a quick follow-up question, and I did want to get on to something else really quick. Jennifer, what's the future of power generation at Clay Boswell in Cohasset?
Great question. So Boswell Energy Center is Minnesota Power's only remaining coal plant and our only remaining source of baseload power. So I mentioned earlier that the Minnesota utilities are very different. Xcel Energy has a significant nuclear fleet, which is carbon free. In Minnesota Power, we've decarbonized our system to the point where we're 50% renewable, and we've closed 7 of our 9 coal units. So Boswell is really like the load-bearing wall of our energy system in northeastern Minnesota. We've committed to being coal-free as a system by 2035. However, we see a need for future generation at the Boswell Center. So we are committed to kind of revisioning the future for Boswell. It's an incredibly important interconnection. It's close to a huge source of load, the mines across the Iron Range, and it's been supporting a host community for decades. So we're dedicated to a future beyond coal at the Boswell Energy Center, and we're excited to see where technology leads us and what options will be available. But The plan is to move Boswell Energy Center off coal by 2035.
Well, I think that leads pretty well into my next question is, as we try to shift to more renewable energies, how do we ensure that, people in these different areas still have economic security, jobs? Obviously, coal was once a very big, powerful, sector. But obviously, the conversation has shifted. So how do we ensure that people are still employed? That's been kind of a big national conversation as well. Sid, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Was the emphasis on employment?
Yeah, people
Yeah.
being just,
Okay.
Exactly.
Sure. So we're actually dealing with that with Coal Creek being sold, and one of our biggest concerns. I mean, they're part of our family. All the employees out there at the mine and at Coal Creek were part of our family, but we knew we needed to move forward, and so we tried very hard and have worked a long time on getting the approvals of the sale of the transmission line and the plant, but it was one of our concerns. So again, it's one of the best thing again is, well, if you're to help with employment, to help with the areas that we're involved in, is actually to go slow. Okay, and I know nobody wants that, but again, you're talking about a lot of jobs, a lot of families, and a lot of local economies, and so we just need to be careful. And this one provided that. We were able to sell to another entity. They can take the time and go slow. We're going to shift our load and go more renewable. But again, just being very careful, not getting in too big of a hurry, will help with that. As far as reliability, okay. Again, the price, the cost of electricity. Right now, the renewables are developing so well that they are a good price. And so for our members, for our customers, we have a really good opportunity to have a good, consistent, and stable price on electricity.
Great. Jennifer, what would you like to add to that?
I'd like to add that, in terms of the research that the center has done on this issue, host community transition is of, special importance to rural Minnesota. And what that means is some of our power plants, like the Boswell Energy Center, are not located near big metro areas, but they're huge employers, right? And they make up a large portion of the revenue in the local area where they are. So this makes worker retraining, worker transition, an even bigger challenge. If you had a power plant, say, close to the Twin Cities, and those workers had to retrain, find other jobs, they might be able to do so without relocating. If you are from northeastern Minnesota, you might know what it feels like to be in a boom-bust economy and try to sell your house when 1,000 other people are leaving. It is challenging. And so there are very real, very human challenges that are, even particularly more impactful in greater Minnesota than maybe in other parts of the state.
Right. I think bottom line is most people, recognize the need for green energy and its importances, but they don't necessarily want to pay for it. Is there a misconception to that it's very costly and it's, not accessible for everybody?
I think the answer, Christina, is that it's complicated. So in many cases, renewable energy can be an incredibly economic resource. It has a number of societal benefits, obviously incredible benefits to the climate, but there's a lot more that goes into the energy transition than just adding renewables. For example, we need to build transmission lines to get that renewable energy from where it's generated to where it's needed, and there's a cost to that. Like Whitney presented in the research, there are fossil fuel plants that still have a balance on them. And when the layman analogy that I think about when I think about this challenge is I might have a vehicle, a car that's not super fuel efficient, but I still have a car payment on it. And certainly there are newer cars that are more fuel efficient and could save money on gas. but I still have to pay off this loan that I still owe on. And so I think the answer, I don't like it when we get into this, renewables are cheaper or they're more expensive, because the truth is our energy system is complex, as it should be. It should be, encompassing diversity of resources. And there's a cost to the infrastructure that maintains the grid. So I like to stay away from, oversimplifying to renewables are more expensive or renewables are cheaper, because the transition itself has a cost.
Sid, do you want to answer this from a rural perspective? I would think people
Sure.
maybe not connected to the metro might have a different view. Maybe not. Maybe I'm incorrect.
Yeah, as Jennifer said, it is very complicated. When we talk about the percentage of our portfolio of power and how much is renewable, there's different ways that you calculate that, and the one that everybody keys on is on the energy that's produced. And so even though Great River Energy has a great amount of its power, will soon have a great amount of its power on the energy that's produced by renewables, there is still a large amount of capacity that we're going to rely on fossil fuels right now. And Jennifer's talked about the lack of nuclear generation facilities. We have none either, also. And that one is carbon free, but again, there's other things that you deal with nuclear power. But when you don't have that, we're just looking at renewables. And if we're not going to have nuclear power, we kind of need those fossil fuels as a backup. And so again, it is very complicated. Now, what are some things that can be done? Again, I mentioned the curtailable and the interruptible loads, especially the commercial and industrial class can work with the utility and look at operating times where renewables are more available. That will help. Okay, there are things we can do, and Steele Waseca has come up with a great solar rebate program, and it's very, very popular with our members. And again, it has great incentive, and it helps them. It actually helps them invest less in size to load, which is always a big deal with utility on too many homes that are like overproducing on their power and going beyond their load. But so we've come up with some thoughtful and kind of creative ways of doing a rebate. All those things matter. For the homes, it's actually a little piece of the pie. But if we develop rates toward time of use, that can help. But again, Jennifer's right. It's very complicated.
Yeah. Let's head back to one of the participants, Troy Goodnow. And this question or kind of remark reminds me of the NPR story yesterday. He says, I'm really excited about the possibility for rural communities to be hubs for energy storage. There are emerging examples of energy storage that use large tanks that use iron solution to store power. Typically, rural communities also have more space as well, unlike urban areas. Ideally, we could fill these energy storage systems with clean energy and then add this power back into the grid during times of peaking. Sounds like a great idea.
I'll start. That we look at different kinds of storage systems, and right now it's very difficult to make it worthwhile. There's a degradation of the system. There's loss, just like if you recharge batteries and then they sit there for a while and then you use them. It actually there's enough of a loss of power, or what we call line loss, that makes it still makes it difficult, but it is coming along. We are still looking heavily at it. There are other types of storage, and I mentioned the water heater load. That in essence is an energy storage system. We call it the battery in the basement, because it actually stores. You heat water, and that is energy, and it's hot water. And then later on, you're going to use that for washing or baths or just whatever. But there's different ways to think of storage systems. It is being developed. It is coming along. I think it is the wave of the future. If more than just vehicles, but I think it's coming along. I don't think it's there yet, but I do think that it will be there. It could be the next greatest thing.
Question for Jennifer. The Minnesota Power is asking the Minnesota PUC to approve an 18% rate increase. Does that request apply to the transition to renewables? If so, how?
Yes, that's true. We filed November 1st to increase rates with our Public Utilities Commission, and that's kind of a part of the process of being a regulated utility, that we can't do that on our own. So we have to provide a request to the commission, goes through an extensive public review process over a year to determine whether the costs that we're seeking to recover were prudently incurred. Part of that is related to the transition to renewable energy. So for Minnesota Power, we passed the 50% renewable mark at the end of 2020. And the last project that allowed us to get to that milestone was importing hydro energy from Manitoba through our Great Northern Transmission Line. And so the costs associated with that hydro purchase are included in this rate case. So it's part of the 18%. But certainly there are other costs included in that in terms of our customer load changes and general business expenses. I think, we're not unlike any other business that's seeing increase in the cost of our inputs. And so that's also part of the rate case. But I would say, yes, the transition is a part of that 18%.
Right. I'd like to bring this up, and there's a article that they link to in science.org. It seems really interesting. They says a new report in Science suggests that we may see more weather variability. Should we get used to vortexes? Seems like climate change has destabilized the jet stream. This may have implications for Minnesota infrastructure too. We are hearing a lot about heat pumps and electrifying everything to meet our carbon goals. Is that possible for us, or are we locked into natural gas? Good.
There's a whole lot being done with heat pumps. They're so much more efficient, and we do encourage them. We offer rebates on them, but they're developing very well. Let's see, on the weather, this is the fun part. We can just guess on what the weather is going to do. However, I think if we guess, we're probably better than most weathermen that we watch on TV. Anyway,
don't tell Ian Leonard that.
I know, but if the weather changes, we're still going to be there. We're going to be there, and we'll be able to take care of it. When the weather changes, okay, if it's going from hot to cold, there's going to be a moment in there in which it's really pretty good, okay, and so you'll see that benefit before it gets to anything that causes higher energy usage. We actually have, again, being the small co-op that we are, we have a lot of substations, and each substation serves less members than you would in a higher density area. And we have one substation that twice a year, we have so many distributed generation sites, and it's mostly wind generation that a lot of our members have put on, that they actually, our members are generating more power than everybody's using on that substation. And so it takes that special equipment so that it doesn't go backwards on the transmission line. But that's just it. If you have this variation of weather, and I'm not talking about all of a sudden it's really colder in the winter and all of a sudden hotter in the summer, but if you have variation that happens intermittently, we'll be all right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, I'd like to kind of end on looking forward and on a, optimistic note. I'd like to just go around the panel, Whitney included, to just kind of give us, just something to think about, next steps, actionable items that we can take to, I guess, make this shift to renewable energy. Jennifer?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm obviously partial to this industry, but I think the electric industry can do incredible things when we are aligned with our policymakers. And you think about, we electrified America, right? We have withstood hurricanes and tornadoes and blizzards and kept the lights on. So I think that we're kind of on it. The research that we talked about today, the planning processes in the state of Minnesota, our policy goals, I think that we are clear-eyed in terms of what's ahead of us and the challenges, and we've got kind of the best and brightest working on it. So I feel very optimistic there. I do think that there is a broader role for the state and potentially the federal government in this transition. So there are certainly things that each utility can and are doing today to reduce carbon on their system, to modernize the grid. But there are also things that might be bigger than each utility, and those things might be, help with community transition and worker retraining, and buying down the cost of the infrastructure needed for the transition. So I'll end on a hopeful note that I think we've got incredibly smart people that are working on this challenging transition. It's an exciting time, and there's a role for the state and federal government to help with the transition.
Great, thank you very much. Sid?
I like the time frame that we're in right now. We at Steele Waseca, it's actually exciting to see so many people want to do something with just renewable development on their own facilities. It's difficult to actually have renewables at your residence that still powers your home when there's an outage. It takes a little bit more, but I think we're headed toward that, and that makes the system a little bit more resilient. We look at the development of renewables with the residential rate class, kind of equal to any kind of efficiencies or conservation programs that someone can take. And so we actually encourage them, and we work with everybody on that. The same as you would have if you got a heat pump, or you had a bigger, more insulated water heater, or you had a solar calculator. But anything like that is just efficient, and actually it's a good sign. We work with our G&T on just developing more toward renewables. We're all concerned about climate change. We're concerned about the carbon production, and so we all work toward that. I think we have some really good things coming online, especially with let's see, the development of batteries. I think cars are a start for how that develops. There are some things that the government can do and has done. Just this last year, we had the ECO Act that went through the state of Minnesota, and it helped helped adjust some very needed things in the SIP program, which was it deals with rebates and how that's applied. But the more that we can do that gives us credit. If the government gives us refunds, that's even better. But if they can do more, that just gives us credit for the things we're already doing and the things that we can encourage. That helps.
Great. Whitney, just real quick, a minute or so on just kind of what we can look forward to next.
Yeah, I mean, in doing this report, I felt really optimistic at the end of it, because we are at this really pivotal moment in this energy transition, and at least our state, in my view, I think everyone's really, for the most part, doing their part, and we're committed to this. And I think one thing that I would really like to see is debt, especially debt from the federal government for co-ops that is tied to coal-fired operations, for that to be forgiven, or just it's one of the biggest barriers for co-ops in transitioning to renewables is these sunk costs and this existing debt. And they only took it out because that was the system that we created, in the 1930s, right? Like it was created for the cooperatives to use. And now we need a system that allows us all to grow together, in the utility industry. So that's the biggest one for me.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Jennifer, Sid, and Whitney for this great discussion. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone who tuned in did as well. I'm Christina Palladino, and I'm going to turn it over to Julie Tash to close us out. Julie?
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Like Whitney and Christina, I learned a great deal today. So thank you to Sid and to Jennifer and to Whitney for the wonderful report. I learned a great deal. I took a lot of notes. Like I mentioned previously, if you would like to see a recording of this webinar, you can go to our YouTube channel next week, and we will have that posted, and you can share that far and wide with whomever you like. And then also you can check out the actual report at our website on ruralmn.org. And also be looking in your email boxes as well, because we do have webinars coming up about every month on a lot of different topics. So thank you everyone so much for tuning in today, and I hope you can stay warm and have a wonderful day.